At 09:15 on the morning of June 12, 1944, Corporal James Miller was pressed flat against the muddy bank of a hedgerow near Saint-Lô, France, and while the air smelled of wet earth and burning cordite, his lungs burned from the sprint across the open field, and his hands were shaking just enough to make the wood of his rifle stock rattle against his helmet. On the other side of the thick wall of roots and dirt, maybe 20 yards away, a German paratrooper was waiting, and this wasn't a movie battle with thousands of men screaming, but was instead a private duel that was quiet, even terrifyingly quiet. Miller could hear the insects buzzing in the tall grass and the blood pounding in his own ears, and he knew the German was listening too, waiting for a specific sound that would tell him it was safe to kill the American. Miller tightened his grip on his M1 Garand, which was a beautiful machine, and the first semi-automatic rifle ever issued to a standard infantryman, giving him an edge because he could fire 8 rounds as fast as he could pull the trigger, while the German had to work the bolt on his Kar 98,000 after every single shot. Miller had the volume, but the German had the patience, and the German knew the secret of the Garand, realizing that the American rifle had a mechanical tell, a flaw that announced exactly when the gun was empty. Miller popped up, firing 2 rounds into the bushes where he thought the enemy was hiding, and the heavy .30-06 bullets shredded the leaves before he ducked back down, resulting in silence because the German didn't return fire as he was counting, and Miller knew he was counting, knowing that was the game. The Garand held 8 shots, and Miller had fired 2, so he had 6 left. He popped up again, firing 3 rapid shots downrange which made leaves fall like confetti, but there was still no return fire as the German was waiting for the magic number. Miller was sweating now, having 3 rounds left in the chamber, and he knew that as soon as he fired that last shot, the rifle would betray him, so he took a breath, gritted his teeth, and rose for the final volley. He fired 3 more times, and the bolt locked back, causing the empty metal clip, made of spring steel, to be automatically ejected from the receiver, flying up and out, tumbling through the air, and striking the receiver on its way out before hitting the hard, rocky ground. The sound was distinct. It wasn't a thud or a clatter, but a sharp, high-pitched, metallic ring, sounding like a tuning fork struck against a glass. To the German paratrooper 20 yards away, that sound was a dinner bell. It meant the American was helpless, and it meant Miller was fumbling for a fresh clip, his fingers slippery with sweat, his gun useless for at least 4 seconds. Before the ring had even faded from the air, the hedgerow exploded as the German soldier burst from his cover, an M40 submachine gun tucked against his hip, and he didn't hesitate or check his corners, but sprinted straight for Miller, screaming, knowing that he had a 4-second window of total immunity. Miller tried to grab a fresh clip from his cartridge belt, but his thumb slipped, and the clip jammed in the pouch. He looked up, his hands empty, his bolt open, staring down the barrel of the enemy gun, and the last thing he heard wasn't a bang, but the mockery of his own weapon telling the enemy to attack. This scene played out hundreds of times across Europe and the Pacific, and good men died because their rifle had a voice, even though the M1 Garand was hailed as the greatest battle implement ever devised by General Patton, and was, in many ways, rugged, powerful, and fast. It allowed a squad of riflemen to put out more firepower than a machine gun team, but it had one glaring, fatal personality defect. It couldn't keep a secret, announcing its emptiness to the world with a cheerful metallic chime that cut through the noise of battle like a referee's whistle when it ran dry. To understand why this happened, you have to look at the design, since most rifles of the era were loaded with stripper clips, simple strips of metal that held the bullets together until you pushed them into the gun, and then you threw the clip away. But the Garand was different because it used an N-block clip. This was a U-shaped piece of spring steel that held 8 rounds. You didn't strip the bullets into the gun, but shoved the entire metal packet, clip and all, down into the magazine, and the clip stayed inside the gun while you fired, as it was part of the mechanism. When you fired the 8th and final round, the rifle's internal machinery sensed the magazine was empty, and the bolt would lock open to let you reload. At the same time, a strong spring would launch the empty steel clip straight up out of the gun to clear the way for a new one. It was a brilliant piece of engineering for rapid reloading, but nobody thought about the acoustics. When that piece of heat-treated steel ejected, it vibrated, and if it hit the receiver, it rang, if it hit a rock, it rang, and if it hit a concrete floor, it rang, making it the sound of a cash register opening, and the price was your life. Back in the United States, the experts at the Ordnance Department scoffed at the complaints, as they sat in offices in Washington or tested rifles on clean, open ranges where everyone wore ear protection. When soldiers wrote reports saying the ping was getting them killed, the experts laughed, arguing that a battlefield was the loudest place on Earth, and between the artillery, the tanks, the grenades, and the screaming, no one could possibly hear a tiny piece of metal hitting the ground. They dismissed the soldiers as being paranoid, stating the noise of combat would drown out the ping. But the experts forgot one thing: combat isn't a continuous wall of noise, nor is it a heavy metal concert that never stops. Combat is a series of violent explosions separated by terrifying silences. It's a rhythm of a burst of fire, followed by silence, then movement, and then silence. In those quiet moments, when a patrol is creeping through a jungle or a squad is hunting house to house in a ruined city, hearing is more important than sight. So you listen for a boot snapping a twig, you listen for the rustle of cloth, and you definitely listen for the sound of an empty gun. The enemy wasn't stupid, because the German Wehrmacht and the Japanese Imperial Army were professional fighting forces that adapted, learning the rhythm of the American weapon, teaching their soldiers to count to 8, and teaching them to listen for the ping, which became a Pavlovian response. In psychology, if you ring a bell every time you feed a dog, eventually the dog starts drooling when he hears the bell. In World War II, the enemy learned that the ping meant the American was defenseless, so the sound triggered an instinct. Charge, the Japanese in the Pacific were especially good at this. In the dense jungles of Guadalcanal and Bougainville, visibility was often less than 10 feet, so you couldn't see the American soldier, but you could hear him. Japanese soldiers would lie in spider holes, hidden under camouflage, letting the point man walk past. They would wait for a firefight to start, listening to the cadence of the Garand and the distinct rhythm of fire. As soon as they heard the metal ring, they would break cover with bayonets fixed, charging the reloader before he could get his next clip in, which was a tactic based entirely on the mechanical arrogance of the American rifle. The soldiers on the line started to hate the sound and felt betrayed by it. Imagine fighting for your life, your adrenaline redlining, and your own weapon is working against you, making it feel like walking around with a "kick me" sign on your back. They tried to modify the clips, but taping them jammed the gun, and greasing them attracted dirt, so there was no way to stop it because the physics of the spring steel meant it was going to ring no matter what. So the infantryman had to live with it, accepting that every time he finished a clip, he was broadcasting his vulnerability. He had to learn to reload in a split second, fumbling with the fresh clip while flinching, expecting a grenade or a bayonet, and the ping became a psychological weight that made them hesitant to fire that 8th shot. Some men would reload after 6 shots just to avoid the noise, ejecting the partial clip manually, which wasted ammo and took time. And while the experts in Washington called the rifle perfect, the men in the mud called it a snitch. But American soldiers are nothing if not adaptable, as they realized that if the enemy was listening to them, then the enemy was predictable. The Germans and Japanese were reacting to a script, trusting the sound more than their eyes, and in war, if you know what your enemy is going to do, you can kill him. The fatal flaw wasn't just a liability, it was an opportunity, a handle that the Americans could grab to flip the table. The idea didn't come from a general or a manual, but started in the foxholes, whispered between veterans who had survived enough charges to see the pattern. They realized that the ping was a lie they could tell, so if the German was waiting for the dinner bell, maybe it was time to ring it early, and maybe it was time to see if the dog would come running for a meal that wasn't there. The bait was set. The hunters were about to become the hunted. To understand how a simple noise became a death sentence, you have to look at the guts of the rifle itself, since the M1 Garand was a marvel of American engineering, but it was fed by a mechanism that was totally unique and, in hindsight, a little bit crazy. Every other army in the world used what we call stripper clips, which were cheap, disposable strips of metal that held 5 bullets together, and you shoved the bullets into the rifle, threw the strip away, and closed the bolt, making it quiet and simple. But the designers of the Garand wanted speed, and they didn't want the soldier fumbling with loose strips, so they wanted a system that was self-contained and automatic. So they created the N-block clip, which was a U-shaped packet made of stiff, heat-treated spring steel. You didn't strip the rounds off it, but shoved the whole thing, metal and all, down into the belly of the gun, making the clip an essential part of the weapon's internal machinery. It held the 8 rounds of .30-06 ammunition tightly against the feed ramp, and as the rifle fired, a follower arm pushed the bullets up, one by one, until the clip was empty. This is where the engineering brilliance turned into a tactical nightmare. When that last round left the barrel, the rifle knew it was hungry, so the bolt would lock back to the rear, holding the action open. At the exact same moment, a powerful ejector spring would kick the empty steel clip straight up out of the gun, and it didn't just fall out, but was launched, flying a few feet into the air, spinning end over end, before landing on the rocky ground or the concrete floor of a ruined building. The problem was the material, because the clip wasn't made of soft aluminum or plastic, but was hardened steel, and when a piece of hardened steel shaped like a tuning fork strikes a hard surface, it doesn't thud, it sings. The sound was a sharp, distinct, high-frequency resonance that cut through the low-frequency rumble of explosions and shouting, making it a sound that carried, and in a quiet lull between bursts of fire, that metallic ring was louder than a shout. It announced to everyone within 50 yards that the American soldier was now holding a 9-pound club instead of a rifle. The enemy soldiers weren't supermen, but they were professionals, and the German Wehrmacht and the Japanese Imperial Army drilled their men on the sounds of Allied weapons. They knew the slow chugging sound of the Browning automatic rifle, they knew the ripsaw-tir of the MG42, and they definitely knew the chime of the Garand, which became a rhythm of survival for them. They would hunker down behind a log or a stone wall, counting the shots, 1, 2, 3, and they would wait, suppressed, unable to move while the American poured fire on their position, 7, 8, and then they would listen for the ring. As soon as that metal hit the ground, the dynamic of the fight flipped because the American was defenseless, and he had to reach into his cartridge belt, fumble with the snaps on the pouch, pull out a fresh block of ammo, jam it into the receiver, and let the bolt fly forward. That process took about 4 seconds for a well-trained soldier, but for a terrified soldier with muddy hands, it could take 10, and that was an eternity in close-quarters combat. The enemy knew they had a window of total safety to pop up, aim, and put a bullet in the American before he could get his gun back in the fight. It was a Pavlovian response, just like the Russian scientist Ivan Pavlov famously trained dogs to drool when they heard a bell because they associated the sound with food. The Germans and Japanese were trained the same way, but the reward wasn't food, it was a kill. The sound of the clip ejecting bypassed their conscious brain and went straight to their muscles, triggering the automatic and predictable command. Hear the ring, charge the target. For a long time, it worked perfectly, as the empty clip was a traitor that signaled the Americans' vulnerability to the world. But combat has a way of evolving, and the soldiers on the front lines, the ones actually dying, started to notice the pattern, realizing that the enemy wasn't charging at random. They were charging on a schedule. Corporal Miller, sitting in the mud of that hedgerow, wasn't thinking about engineering or psychology, he was just thinking about staying alive. He looked at the empty clip lying in the dirt next to his knee, realizing it was just a piece of stamped metal, harmless and inert, but to the German on the other side of the bushes, that piece of metal was a green light. Miller picked up the empty clip, feeling the cold and grit-covered object in his hand, and though it felt light and insignificant, he realized that this little object had power because it controlled the enemy's behavior. If the German was waiting for the sound, he was essentially a puppet waiting for Miller to pull the string, and Miller realized, with a sudden dark clarity, that he didn't actually have to be out of ammo to pull that string. He could lie. The MacGyver moment didn't happen in a laboratory, it happened right there in the dirt. Miller grabbed a fresh clip from his belt and rammed it into his rifle, and the bolt slammed home, so he was loaded with 8 rounds of high-velocity death sitting in the chamber and the magazine, ready to kill. But he didn't fire. Instead, he took the empty clip he had scavenged from the ground and held it in his left hand, gripping it tightly against the wood of the rifle stock. He looked at the other men in his squad who were pinned down, heads buried in the dirt, waiting for the German machine gunner to reload or for a mortar to drop on their heads, because they were stuck, and the German paratrooper across the way had the angle on them, waiting for them to move or waiting for them to run dry. Miller signaled to his squad leader, tapping his helmet, then pointing to the empty clip in his hand. The squad leader frowned, confused for a second, and then his eyes widened, realizing it was a risky, stupid, brilliant idea. The plan was simple, but the timing had to be perfect. If Miller messed it up, he would be standing up with a rifle while the German was already shooting. The trick relied on the enemy's greed. The German had to believe with total certainty that Miller was helpless, and he had to be so sure of the kill that he would abandon his cover and rush forward, trading his safety for speed. Miller signaled the count, raised his rifle, and fired blindly over the hedgerow for 1 shot. He waited a second, then fired 2 shots, pausing to let the silence hang heavy in the air because he wanted the German to be listening, to be counting. He fired a rapid burst of 3, 4, 5, then stopped, knowing the German was ticking them off on his fingers. 6, 7. Miller took a deep breath, recognizing this was the moment of truth, and he fired the 8th shot into the dirt bank, but he didn't let the bolt lock back, as the rifle was actually still loaded, having only fired part of the clip. But the German didn't know that. The German only knew the count. Miller ducked down behind the cover of the roots, waiting exactly 1 heartbeat, the time it would take for the mechanism to eject the clip. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he threw the empty steel clip against the hard wooden stock of his rifle. The sound was perfect, ringing out through the clearing with a crisp, metallic note that signaled the end of the ammunition supply. It was the dinner bell. To the German soldier waiting 20 yards away, that sound was the confirmation he had been waiting for. The American was empty. the American was panicking, and the American was dead. Miller didn't fumble for a reload or reach for his belt. He adjusted his grip on the rifle, keeping his finger on the trigger, and brought the stock up to his shoulder, keeping his head low, his eyes locked on the gap in the bushes where the German was hiding. He was betting his life that the Pavlovian training would override the German's caution, betting that the promise of an easy kill would be too tempting to resist. For a split second, nothing happened, and the silence stretched out, agonizing and thick, while Miller's heart hammered against his ribs. He wondered if the German had realized the trick or was waiting for Miller to pop up, because if the German stayed put, this was just a waste of time. But then the brush crashed and the trap snapped shut. The German paratrooper broke cover, and he didn't peek, he lunged. He came out of the foliage fast, his weapon raised but not aimed, his eyes focused on the spot where he thought Miller was fumbling with a reload. He was moving with the total confidence of a predator closing in on wounded prey, having left the safety of his earthwork, exposing his entire upper body to the open air, and he was committed, unable to stop his momentum. Miller rose, not looking like a man fumbling with a clip, but like a statue of vengeance, and the rifle was rock steady, the barrel already pointed at the gap. The German saw him, he saw the muzzle, and he saw that the bolt was closed, not open, realizing the lie too late. His eyes went wide, a look of absolute betrayal and shock, and he realized in that fraction of a second that the machine hadn't failed. The machine had lied to him. Miller didn't hesitate or feel guilty about the trick, as this was war, and war is the art of deception. He squeezed the trigger, and the Garand roared. The bullet caught the German mid-stride, slamming into his chest and knocking him backward into the brush he had just vacated, proving the trap had worked, and the fatal flaw had just killed the man who tried to exploit it. The rest of the squad stared at Miller, having just watched him invent a new way to kill, and they looked at their own empty clips lying in the mud, no longer seeing trash but seeing bait. The word spread down the line like wildfire. "Save your clips," the veterans whispered to the replacements, telling them to keep one in your pocket, make it ring. The escalation had begun, and the Americans weren't just fighting with bullets anymore. They were fighting with sound, and the enemy, trained to listen for the dinner bell, was about to find out that sometimes the bell rings for the butcher, not the dog. The stalemate in the hedgerow had dragged on for 20 minutes, but in the compressed reality of combat, it felt like a lifetime. The time was 10:42 in the morning. Corporal Miller was crouched behind the thick tangle of roots and earth that the French farmers called a bocage, which was nature's perfect fortress, a wall of dirt 3 feet thick topped with ancient, twisted oak trees. On the other side, less than 25 yards away, was a German paratrooper with a machine pistol, and the air between them was thick with humidity and the smell of crushed vegetation, creating a standoff. If Miller moved left or right, the German would hear him and spray the bushes. If the German moved, Miller would put a .30 caliber hole in him. They were locked in a game of statues, waiting for a mistake. Miller checked his weapon, and the M1 Garand was hot to the touch, with the wood of the foregrip sweating oil. He pulled the operating rod back slightly, just enough to see the brass casing of the cartridge in the chamber, but not enough to eject it. He had a full clip of 8 rounds loaded, and he let the bolt slide forward with a metallic click. The German heard it, and a burst of automatic fire shredded the leaves 6 inches above Miller's helmet, showing the German was jumpy and terrified men make mistakes if you push the right buttons. Miller reached into his left pocket and pulled out the bait, which was the empty end-block clip he had salvaged earlier, and he held it in his palm, feeling the cold, Parkerized steel. It was light, weighing less than 2 ounces, but it held the weight of a life. The plan was risky, requiring him to fire his weapon, which would give away his exact position, and then rely on a split-second deception to survive the counterattack. If the German decided to throw a grenade instead of charging, Miller was dead. If the German decided to wait for a clear visual, Miller was dead. The trick only worked if the German was operating on pure instinct. Miller signaled to the private next to him, a kid from Ohio named Reynolds, pointing to the empty clip, then to his rifle, then to the German position. Reynolds' eyes went wide, and he shook his head violently, believing it was a suicide play, but Miller ignored him. He shifted his stance, digging his boots into the soft mud to get a solid firing platform, needing to be ready to pivot instantly. He took a deep breath, held it, and rose up. He didn't aim for the German. He aimed for the dirt bank just to the left of the enemy position. He pulled the trigger, and the rifle kicked against his shoulder one. He fired again, too. He paused, wanting the German to register the rhythm, wanting the enemy to start the mental countdown. Miller fired a rapid burst of 3 shots that made 5. He ducked back down behind the roots as a return burst of bullets snapped overhead, cutting twigs that rained down on his shoulders. The German was returning fire, but he wasn't moving. He was waiting for the magic number, waiting for 8. Miller waited 5 seconds, letting the silence settle, then popped up again and fired 2 more rounds, 6, 7. He dropped back down instantly. He now had 1 round left in the chamber, and the rifle was live and deadly, but to the German counting the shots, Miller was 1 trigger pull away from being empty. The German was probably tensing his muscles, getting his boots under him, preparing to sprint the moment he heard the ejection cycle. This was the hardest part. Miller had to simulate the end of the firing cycle without actually firing the last round. He grabbed the empty clip in his left hand, held his rifle in his right, and slammed the steel clip hard against the receiver of the Garand. The sound was unmistakable, that sharp, resonant, singing note that every soldier on the battlefield knew, and it cut through the heavy air like a knife. It signaled that the internal magazine was empty, the bolt was locked back, and the American was helpless. To add to the performance, Miller tossed the empty clip high into the air. It spun over the hedgerow, catching the sunlight, and landed with a clatter in the open space between the lines, which was the perfect visual confirmation to back up the audio lie. Miller didn't freeze or wait to see if it worked. The moment the clip left his hand, he brought both hands back to the rifle. He pulled the stock tight into his shoulder pocket, pressed his cheek against the wood, aligning the rear peep sight with the front sight post, and aimed directly at the gap in the bushes where the muzzle flashes had been coming from. He was betting everything on the German's greed. For 1 agonizing second, nothing happened, and the insects buzzed, the wind rustled the leaves. Miller's finger hovered over the trigger, taking up the slack, and he wondered if the German had figured it out or was waiting. Then the bushes exploded. The German paratrooper broke cover, not just peeking but committing. He surged out of the greenery, his gray uniform stark against the bright green of the field, and he was moving fast, his submachine gun raised but not shouldered. He was sprinting, closing the distance, trying to get to Miller before the American could fumble a fresh clip into his gun. His face was twisted in a shout of triumph, his eyes locked on the spot where Miller had ducked down, thinking he had 4 seconds of free time and was hunting a defenseless man. He was wrong. Miller didn't flinch or panic. He tracked the running target. At 15 yards, the German looked huge in the aperture sight. Miller could see the buttons on his tunic and the sweat on his face. The German was expecting to see a man fumbling with a cartridge belt. Instead, he saw a muzzle pointed straight at his chest. Miller saw the realization hit the enemy soldier. It wasn't a thought, but a physical flinch. The German's eyes went wide, his mouth opened, and he tried to skid to a stop, digging his heels into the grass, trying to bring his own weapon up to aim. But momentum is a cruel law of physics. He was moving too fast to stop, and he was too close to miss, so the hunter had run straight into the spear. Miller squeezed the trigger. The 8th round, the one the German thought was already gone, left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second, and at this range, the ballistics were devastating. The .30-06 bullet slammed into the German's chest with the force of a sledgehammer. It didn't just poke a hole, it transferred massive kinetic energy. The German was lifted off his feet. His forward momentum stopped instantly, and he was thrown backward, his submachine gun flying from his hands. He hit the ground hard, rolling once before coming to a stop in the tall grass. Miller didn't celebrate or pause. The ping trick had worked, but now he really was empty. The bolt locked back on the empty chamber, the real clip, the one that had actually been in the gun, ejected with a genuine metallic ring. But this time, nobody was alive to hear it. Miller hit the clip release, grabbed a fresh 8-round block from his belt, and shoved it home with the heel of his hand. The bolt slammed forward, and he was back in the fight. He scanned the hedgerow, checking for a second man or a spotter. The field was silent, and the only movement was the gentle swaying of the grass where the German had fallen. Miller signaled to Reynolds, and they moved up, crouching low, rifles at the ready. They reached the German's body, and the paratrooper was dead before he hit the ground, his face still holding that look of total shock. The expression of a man who realized too late that the rules of the game had changed. Reynolds looked at Miller, then at the dead German, and then at the empty clip lying in the dirt a few feet away. He picked it up, tapped it against his helmet, and the sound rang out, causing a slow smile to spread across his face. It wasn't a smile of joy, but the grim, dark humor of a survivor. He realized that the piece of junk metal they had all cursed for months was actually a weapon, a whistle that called the enemy out of their holes. But the trick wasn't just about one kill. It was about the psychological virus it planted. As the squad moved forward, clearing the rest of the field, the story spread and men whispered it to each other during the lulls in the fighting. They talked about how the dinner bell could be used to serve a different kind of meal, and they started collecting empty clips, practicing the toss, realizing that they could control the rhythm of the battle. Later that afternoon, the squad hit another pocket of resistance near a farmhouse, where a German machine gun team was dug in behind a stone wall, pinning down the entire platoon. The lieutenant was shouting for a bazooka, but the bazooka man was dead and they were stuck. Miller crawled up to the lieutenant, explained the trick, and the lieutenant looked at him like he was crazy, but he was desperate enough to try anything. They set up a coordinated deception. 3 riflemen fired a synchronized volley at the stone wall, and then, on Miller's signal, all 3 men stopped firing at once. They grabbed empty clips and smashed them against the rocks in front of them, and the sound was a chorus of ringing steel, making it sound like the entire American line had run dry at the exact same moment. It was too tempting, and the German gunners, thinking they had caught the Americans in a collective reload, popped up from behind the wall to traverse their weapon. They exposed their heads and shoulders, trying to get a better angle for the slaughter, but they were greeted by a volley from 5 other M1 Garands that had been waiting, fully loaded, for exactly that movement. The machine gun crew was wiped out in a second, and the fatal flaw had just cleared a path that a bazooka couldn't. The sun began to set over the French countryside, and Miller sat against a tree, cleaning his rifle. He wiped the mud from the receiver, polished the gas cylinder, and looked at the weapon with a new kind of respect. It wasn't perfect, as it was loud, heavy, and glitchy, but it was teaching him how to think, teaching him that in war, everything is a tool. The mud is a tool, the shadows are a tool, and even the noise of your own empty gun is a tool, if you have the guts to use it. He picked up a fresh clip of ammunition, ran his thumb over the brass casings, slid it into the rifle, and felt the satisfying crunch as it locked into place. He was ready for the next day, knowing the Germans would eventually catch on, as they weren't stupid. They would learn that the ping didn't always mean safety, and they would start to hesitate, and that hesitation was a weapon too. If the enemy was afraid to charge when he heard the ring, then Miller would have those extra 4 seconds to reload in peace. Either way, the Americans won. The ping had gone from a liability to a mind game, and Miller was holding all the cards. The dinner bell would ring again tomorrow, and the Germans would have to decide if they were hungry enough to take the risk. As the war pushed deeper into Germany and the Pacific Islands, the story of the ping began to change. In the beginning, it was a ghost story, something terrifying that new recruits whispered about in the barracks, as they were scared that the noise would get them killed. But by 1945, the story had flipped, becoming a legend of revenge. The empty clip wasn't a liability anymore. It was a badge of honor, and veterans would show the new guys how to carry an empty one in their pocket, demonstrating the flick of the wrist to make it ring against the stock. It became a secret handshake among the frontline infantry, a way of saying, "We know the machine is broken, but we're smart enough to fix it." The experts back in Washington never really understood what was happening. To the engineers at the Springfield Armory, the M1 Garand was a collection of blueprints and tolerances. They measured success in rounds per minute and muzzle velocity, but they didn't measure psychology, nor did they understand that a weapon is more than just a tool for throwing lead, but is a participant in the conversation of battle. The ping was the rifle speaking, and while the engineers tried to figure out how to silence it, experimenting with plastic clips and different springs, the soldiers had already stopped listening to them. They didn't want a silent gun anymore. They wanted a gun that could lie. When the war finally ended, the millions of Garands were packed into crates and shipped home or given to allies, and the noise that had defined a generation of combat faded into silence. The soldiers returned to their farms and factories, putting their uniforms in the attic and trying to forget the smell of cordite, but the sound stayed with them. Ask any World War II veteran about the M1 Garand, and the first thing they will do is smile, and then they will mimic that distinct metallic ring. It's the soundtrack of their survival. It's the sound that signaled they had emptied their weapon at the enemy and lived to reload. But history is a funny thing. As the years passed, the ping trap became a subject of debate. Modern historians and armchair generals started to argue that it was a myth, looking at the decibel levels of a battlefield, the roaring tanks, the artillery, the screaming, and saying it was impossible. They claimed that no German or Japanese soldier could possibly hear a tiny piece of steel hitting the ground in the middle of a war, calling the story a soldier's tall tale, something invented in a bar to impress civilians. These critics are missing the point, as they are thinking about war like a movie, where the noise is a constant, deafening wall of sound, but real war isn't a movie. Real war is hours of terrifying silence punctuated by seconds of extreme violence. In a dense jungle on a Pacific island, or a quiet hedgerow in France, the world is incredibly quiet. You are hunting. You are listening for a footstep, a cough, or the metallic click of a bolt. In those moments of high-stakes hide-and-seek, the distinct ring wasn't just audible, it was deafening, a dinner bell ringing in a library. We also have the testimony of the men who were there, and we have letters and diaries from American GIs who swear by the tactic, along with accounts from German soldiers who admitted that they were trained to wait for the sound. You don't train an entire army to listen for a noise that doesn't exist. The ping was real, the danger was real, and the trap was real. It might not have worked in the middle of a massive artillery barrage, but in the intimate, close-quarters duels that decided who lived and who died, it was a decisive factor, a game of poker played with bullets, and the Americans were bluffing with the best hand. The legacy of the M1 Garand goes beyond the noise. It is widely considered the best rifle of the war. General George S. Patton, a man who didn't give compliments lightly, called it the greatest battle implement ever devised, and he was right. It gave the American infantrymen a massive advantage. While the Germans were working the bolt on their rifles after every shot, the American could fire 8 rounds as fast as he could pull the trigger. That fire superiority allowed small squads to pin down much larger enemy forces, and the ping was just the price of admission for that power, the quirk of a genius design. Today, the M1 Garand is a piece of history, and you can see them in museums, sitting behind glass, looking heavy and old, but the legend of the ping is more alive than ever. It has become a pop culture icon. In video games like Call of Duty or Battlefield, when you fire that last round, you hear the sound. It's satisfying, it's definitive, and it triggers a rush of dopamine for the player. It's the audio signal for job done. Millions of kids who have never held a real gun know exactly what that sound means. It has crossed over from a tactical flaw to a cultural symbol of American grit. But we shouldn't forget the reality behind the symbol. We shouldn't forget Corporal Miller and the thousands of men like him who had to figure this out the hard way. They didn't have a restart button. They didn't have a tutorial. They were dropped into a nightmare with a weapon that announced their location to the enemy. They were mocked by the experts who said it didn't matter, and instead of complaining, instead of giving up, they turned the problem into a solution. They took the thing that was supposed to kill them and used it to kill the enemy. That is the true lesson of the ping. It's not about the mechanics of a rifle clip, it's about the mindset of the American soldier, and it's about the refusal to be a victim of circumstance. When the world hands you a defect, you don't just fix it, you weaponize it. You take the disadvantage and you wrap it in a trap. You let the enemy laugh at your mistake right up until the moment the trap snaps shut. The ping is a reminder that innovation doesn't always come from a laboratory. Sometimes, it comes from a muddy ditch in France. It comes from a terrified kid realizing that his enemy is acting like a trained dog. It comes from the desperation of survival. The engineers built the gun, but the soldiers finished it. They gave it a soul. They took a cold machine and taught it how to lie. So the next time you watch a World War II movie and you hear that distinctive metallic ring, don't just think of it as a cool sound effect. Think about what it meant in 1944. Think about the 4 seconds of panic that followed it. Think about the German soldier waiting in the bushes, counting to 8, and think about the American soldier, grinning in the dirt, holding a full clip in his gun and an empty one in his hand, waiting to ring the bell. We rescue these stories to ensure that men like Corporal Miller don't disappear into silence. We tell them because they remind us that the difference between a flaw and a weapon is often just a matter of imagination. The ping wasn't a mistake, it was an opportunity, and the men who seized that opportunity deserve to be remembered not just as soldiers, but as innovators who hacked the psychology of war. If this story gave you chills, if you could hear that steel ring in your head, do me a favor, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm that we care about the details. It tells the system that we want to hear about the small, weird moments that changed history. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive into the archives. Leave a comment below. Have you ever fired a Garand? Did you hear the ping? Do you think the tactic is a myth or a fact? Tell us where you're watching from. We read every single one. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping us keep the legend of the empty clip alive. The gun is empty, the clip is on the ground, but the story is still ringing.